Jim Bradley, and I wanted to show you a simple jig that I made today for cutting wedges for wedged dovetail joints in timber frame structures. You could use this same simple jig if you were making shims, for example, for windows indoors. And here is the jig, and here's the stock I'm going to be cutting, which is oak, because the structure is going to be exposed to the elements, and oak's supposed to do pretty well, white oak that is. What I'm going to do first is just show you how the jig works, and later on, if you want to stick around, I'll explain a little bit more of the details of how it's designed and how it works. You'll notice as I'm going through this that occasionally I'm going to flip the stock end for end. And again, if you want to hang around for the details later, I'll explain why I'm doing that. So let me fire things up and we'll show you how this thing works. And there you have it. There's a bunch of wedges or shims, whatever you need. If you're interested in the details on how to make one of these jigs, that's what I'm going to talk about now and for the remainder of the video. Shims and wedges, they're not that expensive, but this jig is pretty convenient to make shims and wedges on demand, and also to basically make them for free using scrap that you're likely to have around your shop, or like in my case, to make wedges out of a particular material that you desire that's appropriate for a particular project. There's basically two parts to the jig. There's the base, the part that's vertical in this image. It's a 2x4 basically, and the rear fence, which is made out of 1x stock. And there's a handle there too, which you could easily make out of plywood. As I use this, there are two surfaces against which I register the stock that is being cut. The first of those surfaces is the left side of the 2x4, and second of those is the inside of the rear fence. That's the area where the stock is held when it gets cut. And those two surfaces are square to one another. There's 90 degrees between them. So that's one part of the geometry of the jig. The next thing to point out on the right side of the body is that that edge is not parallel to the left side of the 2x4. In fact, there's two bevels there. From the bottom and 5 inches up from there, I've cut a taper, and that taper is the feature that causes the taper to be put into the wedges or the shims that you're going to be making. So whatever angle you cut that taper at is going to specify the geometry of your wedges. In my case, I wanted to cut stock that was about 5 inches long, and I wanted to go from 1/8 of an inch thick to 3/8 of an inch thick. So over 5 inches, there's a 1/4 inch difference in that taper. And so depending on what geometry you want your wedges or your shims to have, you'll either cut more or less taper on that right hand side. And no surprise, I cut the taper in this mini taper jig using a taper jig. You can use a store-bought jig if you have one of those. In this case, I just used a piece of 3/4 inch MDF with some carpet tape to hold that 2x4 base in the proper position as I was cutting the taper. One thing to note about the taper is it determines the difference in the thickness of the wedge or the shim, the difference from the thick side minus the thinner side. And like I said, in my case, I wanted a 1/4 inch difference, so there's a 1/4 inch of taper there. The actual dimensions of how thin your wedge is at the thin side and how thick it is at the thick side is determined by where you set your fence. In other words, how far that left side of the 2x4 is away from the circular saw blade on your table saw. And what happens is that right hand side goes against your tabletop, your table saw fence that I've shown here in blue. And so it causes those two surfaces against which we register the stock, the left side of the 2x4 and the rear fence, not to be square to the fence, and hence not square to the saw blade that I've tried to picture here toward the top. And so as a result of that, there's an angle that's shown here with red lines between the saw blade and the left hand side of that 2x4 base. And if we fill that in, that basically represents the piece that we're going to cut out, which is our shim or our wedge. And you can see it does have an angle to it, again determined by the taper that's cut on the right hand side of that 2x4 body. So we start with square stock and we make a first cut like this. And there is the wedge that would be taken out of our original square stock. And I'm showing here that when I have a piece of stock that is square, that I'm going to be registering it against two sides. The 2x4, the left hand side of the 2x4, and the front side of the rear face, because remember that angle is 90 degrees. And then I cut my wedge out. Well, at that point, our stock is no longer square. It looks something like this. Now, if we didn't do something to change the orientation of this stock and kept cutting it in this same orientation, eventually we would end up with something that looked like this. And this causes a lot of problems. First of all, it's difficult to register because you don't have anything to push against that's parallel to the left side of that 2x4 in the jig. Also, the wedges are going to be getting, at first, longer and then eventually shorter. And you're very likely to be throwing away more material that you can't use. So we have wedges that aren't uniform in length, perhaps some safety issues. So this is not a good situation. So the way that I get around this is that after I cut a square piece of stock so that it's no longer square, what I do is I flip it end for end, top to bottom, and then I put it into the jig. And you'll see here the red arrow on the right hand side shows that in this circumstance our stock is only registering against the 2x4 base, and you'll see toward the bottom of the jig near the rear fence there's actually a gap or an angle between the stock and the rear fence. That's okay. So then you cut your next wedge and it looks something like that. So flipping the piece every other cut, top to bottom, essentially helps you alternate which end of the board, the top or the bottom, you're cutting the thicker or the thinner slices out of. So over time, the width of the board is reduced uniformly, top to bottom. And so after the second cut, with the thicker part of the wedge taken out of the other end of the board, what you're left with is the piece that you're left with should be just about square, 90 degrees on every corner. And at this point, it's just like you're starting all over again with a fresh piece of stock, and you cut your next wedge. So what you end up doing here is every other cut, you rotate the piece end for end, and you end up going back every other cut to a square piece of stock, and all your shims are the same length.